welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name's Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs and try to do those things more responsibly. So today I've got a monologue video, and I know I've had a lot of conversations lately, and I've really enjoyed those, but I have been feeling lately that I want to kind of take a step back, and before I start exploring more beliefs and the way that we interact with them, I kind of want to go to the core and sort of the roots of what I think this lies in, and probably the seeds and the roots of where all of this, why all of this has led me here. And that's sort of this idea of truth and exploring that. So about 5 years ago, before I started my deconstruction, I had a conversation with a friend, and I don't quite remember what it was about, but it was probably about religion or something. And I remember having the conversation and responding to some question about how I personally found something to be true. And they said something to me that sort of stuck in my brain and that I could never really shake. And it was that just because I personally believe something to be true doesn't make that ultimately true. And in the grand scheme of things, that's a very simple thing to say and sort of a simple idea, but it got me to stop and to think, and it made me sort of reevaluate and think about the way that I was processing things and sort of why I was processing information in the first place. I think there's a lot of reasons why we can seek out information. I think one of the big ways is because we want to be better communicators in conversations. We want to be informed. We want to have the right information to be able to sit and talk with others we care about, whether it's to really connect with them, maybe even impress them, or just not feel like you're being blindsided. And so we chase those things to have that at our disposal and ready to be better communicators. I think on the other side, there's this also level of security that comes from having information. We need something solid to stand on. We need a foundation, and we use information and the cultivation of that to create that thing that we can look to and hold on to, and gives us something to hold on to as we move forward and act in the world. And while both of those things can be good and bad, and I've probably participated in information consumption on both levels, I think at the root of what was driving me to consume was this sense of seeking truth. I wanted to know what was true and try to make sense of the chaos and the varying opinions that were out in the world. And I use information and the consumption of that to help me try to evaluate and get to that sort of perspective of truth. And, as we as humans start consuming information and engaging with other people and living and experiencing life, we start picking up these pieces of information and putting them together and creating a worldview and a set of beliefs that we individually hold to be true. And for me, this is sort of the process and what, entails this idea of personal truth. It's the deep held beliefs, ideas, opinions, life experiences that shape you and give you a view of the world and how you perceive it through. And often when you start talking about personal truth, there's a tendency to lead into subjectivism. Now, I do not want this video to all be about subjectivism, but I did want to address it a minute because it's so easy to take this idea of personal truth and pivot to that area. So before I kind of move on, I just want to tackle that and walk through that. So subjectivism, this idea that there isn't really objective truth in the world. It's all sort of personally curated. What might be true for me is not necessarily true for you. And that's very broad, sort of broad paintbrush definition. But when we talk about subjectivism in broader culture, I think that's what most people think about it. This opinion-based idea of what is true. And because there's so many varying beliefs and there's this spirit of respecting other people and their journeys and their convictions in the broader culture, it becomes really easy to say it might be reasonable that subjectivism is true and everything that we see within our differences is just accumulation of personal taste. And so we shouldn't be so worried about these huge differences that we see in the world. And I'm not going to argue that subjectivism doesn't exist to any extent, because I don't think that's true. And I don't think anyone really thinks that's true. I think there's a lot of things that we can all agree on that at the end of the day, there can be discrepancies in what we believe and it doesn't matter. But I think the bigger question is everything that we believe subjective? Is all our world shaped by personal truth? And through the time that I've taken to process all of this stuff, I found that worldview very unsustainable. And there's a lot of reasons, but to get to the core of it, I think the biggest reason I can't hold to subjectivism is because I can't ever act like I really believe it's true. Anytime I believe an action, an idea, or an ideology is more profitable than another, enough to where I'm willing to argue it over another, it kind of goes in the face of the ideology of subjectivism. It doesn't align with that worldview. And you could make the case that the worldview still exists, but I'm not operating in the right spirit. And that's a distinct possibility. But even if I got to the place where I could figure out how to live as subjectivism really is true and never judge another opinion over another and act as if they're all personal preferences, the ideology leaves me with a question of why I should even believe that ideology is better than another or just my subjective taste. And I don't think there's a way we can ever find a way to agree, and probably not a reason to try to get everybody to agree, because what's the point? I mean, except for maybe some social harmony or, having some instinct within us that helps our survival. But at the end of the day, that doesn't give me clarity about the truth of those things either. So it feels like I'm left with nothing to ground myself in. I'm just surrounded by a hodgepodge of personal ideas that's been personally curated for myself with no real justification of why I should believe something over another. And then outside of that, I think when it comes to subjectivism, it leaves us to question what truth is at all and the place that it holds within our world. If all truth is just created by personal whim and there's no real universal understanding of anything that we can all agree on outside of our own personal preferences, I don't see a way to really have truth. So in this case, to me, truth becomes a delusion, and there's nothing I can really say or do to defend it. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, none of us are full-blown wholesale subjectivists, even though that may seem appealing. Although I think you really start thinking about it and take that to its logical conclusion, there are some issues with this subjectivism idea that can be pretty troubling. But again, this video is not really about subjectivism. This is about personal truth and ultimate truth and how we can understand those things and how they work in the way that we confront ideas and information. So when we're talking about truth, I think it's safe to say that it's something bigger than just what we personally believe or we put our trust in. There's something outside of that. We're never going to escape looking at the world in a subjective manner, because that's the only way we can. We experience the world individually, and we're processing it through our emotions and our background and our limited subjective opinion. But although we view the world through our subjective lenses and our subjective experiences, we do have certain personal beliefs that are making objective truth claims about the world. We can't escape that. And if there is some objective reality outside of our personal world, then there is something that is ultimately true. So if there is something that is ultimately true, it would be all of the things that make up our objective reality. It's the facts, the figures, the data that come together to show us how the world actually is, what lies in it and underneath it. It's the foundation that we can stand on and we can point to and get a bearing of what's real outside of ourselves. And it wouldn't be shaped by our own opinions and perspectives of personal truth. In fact, it's unfazed by it. So if personal truth and ultimate truth both exist, my next question is, does it matter if they line up? Does it matter that they're congruent with each other? And I think the answer to that question is it depends. So if subjectivism is true, my personal opinion doesn't really matter. But if objectivism is true, even to a mild degree, my personal beliefs and actions do have a potential to have an effect on the way they interact with reality. I think the severity of those discrepancies would probably depend on the significance of how those two things interact within the world and what are the consequences for my false belief matching with reality. For example, let's take the Earth question. Is it flat? Is it round? I want to know the right answer. I want to hold the answer that's ultimately true. But when I really think about the consequences that lie within my everyday life of having the wrong answer to that question, it's very limited. I'm still going to go on about my day and there's not a lot to risk. However, if I have the wrong assumptions about gravity and I act off them, jumping off a cliff could be very life-threatening, and the risks are much higher to having the wrong answer personally to that question. And so I think that we can show that depending on what we're talking about, there are certain things that it's more important to know the truth of than others. Now, this is where I think religion, spirituality, and these big cosmic conversations start to complicate the equation. Now, there are some religions and some worldviews that have more of a universal view, a little more space and wiggle room for the answers to all these questions. And there's some worldviews that I think subjectivism fits in just fine. But on the other hand, there's other worldviews that are incredibly exclusive. And to have them sit together side by side creates worldviews that are diametrically opposed. And I don't think that's something we should ignore. I think there are some things we can more easily demonstrate and understanding the severity of knowing the truth of them. And I think often when we're talking about religion and what we personally believe to be true, it's hard to separate that from this idea of ultimate truth. And how do we compare that with the other worldviews and religions around us? And what is the severity of those things being true or untrue? In some worldviews, the severity of those things being truthful or not truthful are inconsequential, but in others, they're not. And depending on which worldview ends up being ultimately true, it comes with a lot of implications and could potentially drastically affect the way that we should design and live our lives. The hard part about religion is that it's so deeply ingrained in so many people, and I personally believe that human beings are very religious beings and we can't help it. And I think it's really easy for us to look at our own personal truths and try to see the objective world we see outside of ourselves and fit it into our frames. And instead of being willing to break our categories and change those things, we can easily fall in the trap of making those things fit our world or rejecting the information we don't like. So as I've continued to walk this path and engage ideas and really tackle the big questions, it's given me a huge respect for this idea of truth. And not just on the personal level, but in the ultimate sense. It's what's driven me to this path of information consumption, but it's also driven me into more engagement with ideas and people and tackling the big questions in a more open way. And I found that when I pursued these things with truth in the right place and in the right spirit, It's helped me do these things better. So moving forward, especially in the next couple of videos, I'm going to keep unpacking this relationship between personal truth and ultimate truth. And I want to explore why both of them are important and how to engage better in the pursuit of both of those things. But for now, I will close with the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.